The sun was setting over the quiet streets of Pine Grove, casting long shadows across the perfectly maintained lawns and picket fences. Agent Thomas Wilson checked his rearview mirror for the third time in 5 minutes. Old habits die hard when you've spent 15 years in the CIA's domestic counterterrorism unit. The classified documents were safely locked in his briefcase, and his mission had gone exactly as planned. All he had to do now was drive through this small southern town and make it back to headquarters. The government-issued black sedan hummed quietly as he drove exactly at the speed limit. Everything about him was precise, from his crisp navy suit to his perfectly knotted tie. At 42, he'd earned every gray hair at his temples through years of high-stakes operations and countless lives saved, though most would never know about them. The first flash of red and blue lights in his mirror didn't surprise him. He'd seen the patrol car trailing him for the past mile, even though he hadn't broken a single traffic law. His hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel as he pulled over, muscle memory from 2 decades of similar stops kicking in. The dashboard clock read 6:47 p.m. Just another day in America, he muttered to himself, reaching for his registration and license before they'd even asked. Through his side mirror, he watched 2 officers approach, one tall and lean, the other shorter with a swagger that spoke of something to prove. Both wore mirrored sunglasses despite the dimming light. The taller officer tapped on his window with a flashlight. License and registration, he demanded without preamble, not even a courtesy good evening. Thomas handed over his documents with steady hands, maintaining eye contact despite the officer's dismissive glance. "Step out of the vehicle," the shorter officer ordered, his hand resting casually on his holstered weapon. Thomas complied smoothly, movements deliberate and non-threatening. He'd been trained to handle situations far more dangerous than this, but sometimes the most dangerous moments came wrapped in everyday encounters. "Would you mind telling me why I'm being stopped, officers?" Thomas asked politely, standing with perfect posture beside his car. The CIA had taught him to read people, and these 2 were an open book, the kind he'd read too many times before. "We've had reports of drug trafficking in the area," the taller officer said, tone dripping with artificial authority. "Your vehicle matches a description." Thomas almost smiled at the obvious lie. His government-issued sedan was about as generic as they came, and he knew for a fact there hadn't been any recent drug trafficking alerts in this area. He'd reviewed the local crime reports before starting his mission, standard CIA protocol. The hidden cameras in his car were recording everything, standard issue for CIA vehicles. More cameras were embedded in his tie clip and watch, capturing every angle of what was about to unfold. Thomas could already guess where this was heading, but years of training had taught him patience. Sometimes the best way to expose corruption was to let it play out while gathering evidence. "Mind if we search your vehicle?" the shorter officer asked, though it wasn't really a question. Thomas knew his rights, knew he could refuse, knew it probably wouldn't matter. He also knew that sometimes the path to justice required taking the longer road. "I do mind, actually," he replied calmly. "I don't consent to any searches of my vehicle or my person." He noticed how the officers exchanged glances, how their postures shifted subtly. The air grew thick with tension as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The shorter officer stepped closer, invading Thomas's personal space. "Sir, are you refusing to cooperate with law enforcement?" Thomas maintained his composure, keeping his voice steady and professional. "I'm exercising my constitutional rights, officer. If you don't have probable cause or a warrant, I'm not consenting to a search." What happened next was so predictable it could have been scripted, but Thomas let it play out. He had learned long ago that sometimes the biggest victories came from letting others believe they had the upper hand. As the officers began their illegal search, he activated the additional recording devices in his car with a supple press of his key fob. The stage was set, the players were in position, and Thomas knew this ordinary traffic stop was about to become something much bigger. But for now, he stood silently, watching the sun disappear behind the trees, knowing that darkness sometimes had to fall before the truth could come to light. The evening air grew cooler as Thomas watched the 2 officers circle his car like vultures sizing up their prey. Every movement they made was captured by his vehicle's hidden cameras, the slight nod between them, the meaningful glances, the way the taller officer kept looking up and down the empty street. "Pop the trunk," the shorter officer commanded, jingling his handcuffs casually against his belt. Thomas pressed the button, knowing his briefcase with classified documents was securely locked with government-grade encryption. He'd been through scenarios like this before, but something about these officers felt different, more deliberate, more practiced. The trunk opened with a soft click. The taller officer made a show of searching through it, while his partner kept Thomas distracted with pointless questions about his travel plans. But Thomas's trained eye caught the shorter officer's hand slipping into his jacket pocket. Years of surveillance experience had taught him to notice these small details, the slight bulge in the officer's pocket that hadn't been there before, the way he positioned himself to block the view from passing cars. "Sir, could you step over here for a moment?" the taller officer called out, his voice carrying an edge of artificial concern. Thomas complied, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel shoulder of the road. He knew what was coming next, had seen it play out too many times in case files that crossed his desk at the CIA. The shorter officer moved to the driver's side door, making a show of searching the front seat. Thomas watched in the reflection of his car's tinted windows as the officer's hand emerged from his pocket, now empty. The hidden camera in the dashboard captured everything in pristine 4K resolution, the small plastic bag being slipped under the driver's seat, the practiced movement that spoke of having done this before. Well, what do we have here?" The officer's voice carried fake surprise as he reached under the seat and pulled out the bag he'd just planted. "Looks like we've got ourselves a situation here, don't we?" Thomas kept his face neutral, even as his mind catalogued every detail of their performance. The way they both touched the bag without gloves, leaving fingerprints that would later become crucial evidence. The timestamp on the hidden cameras that would show the bag appearing out of nowhere. The GPS coordinates that proved he'd never been anywhere near any drug locations. "That's not mine," Thomas stated calmly, knowing his words were being recorded by multiple devices. "And I think we both know where it came from." He maintained eye contact with the taller officer, whose swagger faltered slightly at Thomas's lack of panic. The shorter officer straightened up, holding the planted evidence like a trophy. "Playing it cool won't help you now, buddy. We've got you red-handed." His partner was already reaching for his handcuffs, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Thomas remained still, his mind already racing ahead to the next steps. The automatic alert that would be triggered at CIA headquarters when he missed his check-in. The tracking devices in his watch and tie clip that were broadcasting his location to satellites overhead. The facial recognition software that was already identifying these officers and building their profiles. "I'd like to make a phone call," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the growing tension. The officers exchanged amused glances, clearly thinking they had the upper hand. "Oh, you'll get your phone call," the taller officer chuckled, "right after we process you downtown." He patted his pocket where he'd stored Thomas's ID and registration, not realizing that every document in that wallet was embedded with tracking devices. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Thomas felt an odd sense of calm. He'd spent years tracking corrupt officials and building cases against them. Now he was about to expose something that had probably been happening in this town for years. Sometimes the best way to catch a predator was to let it think it had caught you instead. The cruiser's back door opened with a creak, and Thomas ducked his head as they guided him inside. Through the partition, he could hear them congratulating each other, already discussing how they'd write up the report. They had no idea that their dash cam was syncing with CIA servers, their radio communications were being recorded, and their cell phone signals were being tracked. As they pulled away from his car, Thomas caught a final glimpse of it in the growing darkness. To anyone passing by, it looked like just another vehicle on the side of the road. But inside, it was a high-tech surveillance system, recording and transmitting everything that had just happened. The truth was already making its way through secure channels to people who would know exactly what to do with it. The police cruiser turned onto the main street, its interior cameras capturing Thomas's composed expression. He'd been in worse situations during his career, much worse. But something told him this case might end up being one of his most important. Not because of any classified mission or national security threat, but because sometimes the biggest dangers to American freedom wore badges and carried the very authority they abused. The fluorescent lights of Pine Grove Police Station buzzed overhead as Thomas sat handcuffed to a metal chair in the processing room. The clock on the wall read 8:15 p.m., nearly 2 hours since the traffic stop. He'd already missed his scheduled check-in with headquarters by 45 minutes, which meant the wheels of justice were already turning, though not in the way these officers expected. "Ready to tell us where you got the drugs?" The taller officer leaned against the desk, trying to look intimidating. His nameplate read Officer R. Parker, though Thomas suspected that would soon be changing to Former Officer Parker. "I'd like to make my phone call," Thomas repeated for the third time, his voice carrying the same calm authority it had back on the road. He watched as Officer Parker's jaw tightened, clearly not used to suspects who remained so composed. The shorter officer, who'd introduced himself as Officer Walsh, slapped a form down on the desk. "First, you're going to fill this out. And drop the attitude, your kind don't do so well in our jail." Thomas let the racial undertone hang in the air, knowing it was being picked up by the recording devices still active in his watch and tie clip. He looked directly at the station's security camera in the corner, its red light blinking steadily. More evidence for the pile. "Actually," Thomas said, sitting up straighter, "I need to inform you that you're currently detaining a federal agent on active duty. That's a serious offense." He kept his tone professional, giving them one last chance to step back from the edge they were racing toward. Officer Walsh laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it now. "Right, and I'm the President of the United States." He grabbed Thomas's wallet from the evidence bag, flipping through it again. "Your ID says you're an insurance salesman from Atlanta." Thomas almost smiled. His cover ID was perfect. It had to be for his work. But right about now, his real credentials would be showing up in federal databases as various agencies ran his fingerprints, which Officer Parker had taken rather roughly earlier. The door to the processing room burst open. A tall man in a sheriff's uniform walked in, his face red with either anger or too many late-night donuts. "What's taking so long with this one?" he demanded, eyeing Thomas with immediate disapproval. "Just another dealer trying to pass through our town, Sheriff," Officer Walsh reported, puffing up his chest. "Caught him with enough evidence to put him away for a while." Thomas watched the interaction with interest, noting how the sheriff barely glanced at the evidence bag. This wasn't just about two corrupt officers, this went higher up the chain of command. "I need to make a phone call," Thomas said again, this time directing his words to the sheriff. "It's my right, and you've already held me here for 2 hours without one." The sheriff snorted. "You'll get your call when we're good and ready. Right now, we're waiting on the drug unit to come field test your little stash." He turned to leave, then paused. "And make sure you search his car thoroughly. These types usually have more hidden away." As the sheriff's footsteps echoed down the hallway, Thomas thought about his car, still sitting on the side of the road. By now, it would be surrounded by an invisible net of surveillance. Any attempt to plant more evidence would be caught in perfect clarity. Officer Parker grabbed Thomas's arm, pulling him roughly to his feet. "Time for your mugshot, big shot." The handcuffs bit into Thomas's wrists as they marched him down the hallway, past cells filled with curious faces. The flash of the camera was bright, and Thomas kept his expression neutral as they took his photos. Front view, side view, just like thousands of other innocent people who'd stood in this same spot. But unlike those others, he knew help was already on the way. They led him to a holding cell, the metal door clanging shut with a final sounding bang. Officer Walsh smirked through the bars. "Enjoy your stay. Maybe this will teach you to respect our town's laws." Thomas sat on the hard bench, listening to their footsteps fade away. He glanced at his watch, the hidden camera still recording, still transmitting. In about an hour, they'd discover his fingerprints matched those of a federal agent. In 2 hours, they'd probably get the first phone calls from Washington. By morning, this entire station would be crawling with federal investigators. But for now, he waited, watching the shadows grow longer on the cell floor. Sometimes justice moved slowly, but it moved with certainty. And when it finally arrived, it would hit this corrupt department like a tidal wave, washing away years of abuse and prejudice. Through the small window in his cell, Thomas could see the stars beginning to appear in the night sky. Somewhere up there, satellites were tracking his location, specialized teams were gathering evidence, and the machinery of federal justice was grinding into motion. These officers thought they were teaching him a lesson about power. Soon, they'd learn one themselves. The CIA Operations Center hummed with activity as the night shift began their routine monitoring. The wall of screens displayed various missions in progress, but one particular alert kept flashing: agent status, check-in overdue. The agent in question was one of their best, and he never missed a check-in. Director Reynolds sat forward in her chair, coffee forgotten as she studied the alert. 20 years of experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, they were screaming that something was wrong. She picked up her secure phone, dialing a familiar number. "Get me Agent Thomas's last known coordinates," she ordered, fingers drumming on her desk. The response came quickly. A small town in the south, precisely where he should be after completing his assigned mission. But he wasn't moving, and his vehicle's GPS showed it parked on the side of a state road. "Pull up all surveillance feeds from the area," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority that had earned her the director's position. Within minutes, multiple screens lit up with satellite imagery, traffic camera feeds, and data from Thomas's car's security systems. The tech team worked silently, their fingers flying over keyboards as they pieced together the events of the evening. The first video feed showed the traffic stop. The second revealed the officers planting evidence. The third captured the arrest. "Get me everything on these officers," Reynolds ordered, her eyes narrowing as she watched the footage. "I want their complete histories, every complaint ever filed, every traffic stop they've made in the last 5 years." The operations center transformed into a hub of focused activity. Analysts pulled records, cross-referenced data, and built a profile of corruption that went far deeper than just 2 officers. Patterns emerged: similar traffic stops, predominantly targeting minorities, evidence appearing mysteriously, cases that never made it to court. "Director," called one of the analysts, "you need to see this." He pulled up a series of documents showing financial transactions. The local sheriff's department had been seizing assets from falsely arrested individuals for years, building a slush fund that lined the pockets of several high-ranking officials. Reynolds reached for her phone again, this time dialing the Department of Justice. This had just become much bigger than a single arrested agent. "This is Director Reynolds from the CIA. We have a situation involving one of our operatives and what appears to be systematic civil rights violations. I need your best people on this." Across town, in the FBI field office, agents were already gearing up. The CIA's alert had triggered a series of protocols designed for situations exactly like this. Teams of investigators gathered equipment, reviewed the incoming evidence, and prepared for what would become one of the most significant police corruption cases in recent history. Back in the operations center, Reynolds watched as more pieces fell into place. Thomas's car cameras had captured over a dozen incidents of other vehicles being stopped in the same location over the past few hours, all following the same pattern, all targeting specific types of drivers. "Contact the Civil Rights Division," she instructed her assistant. "Tell them to pull every case file from this jurisdiction for the past decade." She knew what they'd find: a pattern of abuse so clear it would be impossible to ignore. The surveillance feeds from the police station showed Thomas sitting calmly in his cell, exactly as he'd been trained. He knew the system was working, knew that help was coming. What the local officers didn't realize was that they'd stumbled into something much bigger than a simple traffic stop. "Director," another analyst called out, "we've got something else." He pulled up a series of reports showing similar patterns in neighboring counties. The corruption wasn't isolated to one department. It was a network, spreading through multiple jurisdictions. Reynolds stood at her command center, watching as the investigation expanded like ripples in a pond. What had started as a missed check-in was unraveling years of systematic abuse. On one screen, she could see federal agents already mobilizing, their vehicles moving silently through the night toward the small town. "Keep monitoring all channels," she ordered. "I want to know the moment anyone in that department realizes what's happening." She picked up a secure tablet, reviewing the evidence one more time. The case was building itself, clear, undeniable, and thoroughly documented. In just a few hours, this quiet southern town would wake up to find itself at the center of a federal investigation. But for now, in the darkness of night, The wheels of justice turned silently but inexorably. Every camera feed, every recorded conversation, every tracked movement was another nail in the coffin of a corrupt system that had operated unchecked for far too long. Reynolds looked at the clock, 11:45 p.m. By sunrise, everything would change for that small town's police department. Sometimes, she thought, the best way to expose corruption was to let it catch itself in the act. And thanks to one patient operative and a web of hidden cameras, that's exactly what had happened. Dawn broke over Pine Grove as District Attorney Phillips rushed into his office, his usually pristine suit wrinkled from a hasty dressing. The call from the sheriff at 5 a.m. had been urgent. They needed charges filed against their latest arrest immediately, before the morning court session. Something about this case felt off. Phillips flipped through the hastily prepared police report, frowning at the obvious inconsistencies. The officer's account of the traffic stop didn't match the dashed cam timestamps. The drug amounts listed seemed too perfectly measured, and the suspect's calm demeanor noted in the booking photos wasn't typical of someone caught drug trafficking. "Sir," his assistant poked her head in, "the sheriff's here. Says it's urgent." Phillips nodded, straightening his tie. He'd worked with these officers long enough to know when they were pushing too hard, too fast. The sheriff burst in without knocking, his face flushed. "Tell me those charges are ready. We need to get this one in front of Judge Turner this morning." He paced the small office, checking his phone every few seconds. "What's the rush?" Phillips asked carefully, watching the sheriff's reaction. "The evidence isn't properly processed yet. The lab reports aren't." "Just do it," the sheriff snapped. "This one needs to stick. Make it happen." He slapped a hand on the desk, making the coffee cups rattle. As the sheriff stormed out, Phillips's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Check your email." Curious, he opened his inbox to find a message from the Department of Justice. His blood ran cold as he read it. Across town, in a small law office, attorney Robert Chen reviewed the case files that had appeared on his desk overnight. To anyone watching, he looked like a local defense lawyer preparing for a routine hearing. They couldn't see the federal prosecutor's badge in his desk drawer or know about his 20 years of experience bringing down corrupt police departments. Chen smiled slightly as he watched the surveillance footage from Thomas's car. The evidence was perfect, clear, undeniable, and damning. His phone buzzed with updates from the FBI team that had quietly slipped into town during the night. They were in position, waiting for the right moment. Back at the police station, Officer Walsh emptied his fourth cup of coffee, trying to shake off his unease. Something about last night's arrest kept nagging at him. The suspect had been too calm, too composed, and now the sheriff was pushing for an immediate hearing, breaking their usual protocol. "The prisoner's ready for transport," Officer Parker announced, looking equally unsettled. They'd both noticed the unusual number of unmarked vehicles parked around town this morning, the strangers in suits sitting in the local diner. In his cell, Thomas listened to the growing commotion outside. His acute hearing picked up fragments of panicked conversations, hurried phone calls, the sound of papers being shredded in distant offices. The department was scrambling, though they didn't yet know why. The courthouse began filling with the usual morning crowd, but today was different. Scattered among the regular attendees were federal agents, civil rights attorneys, and FBI investigators, all playing their roles perfectly. They sat quietly, waiting for the show to begin. District Attorney Phillips sat in his office, staring at his computer screen. The evidence from the DOJ was overwhelming. Years of traffic stops following the same pattern, asset seizures that never made it to the books, cases thrown out due to missing evidence. And at the center of it all, a network of corrupt officers protected by the very system they were sworn to uphold. His phone rang again, the sheriff, demanding to know if the charges were filed. Phillips looked at the draft complaint on his desk, then at the DOJ email. In 30 years of practicing law, he'd never faced a moment quite like this. Attorney Chen prepared his briefcase for court, carefully arranging the evidence that would soon destroy the department's carefully constructed facade. The thumb drive containing Thomas's car footage sat innocently next to papers detailing years of similar cases, all ready to be presented at the perfect moment. Outside the courthouse, news vans began arriving. Someone had tipped them off about a big story breaking, though none of them knew exactly what it was yet. Reporters set up their equipment, sensing something significant in the air. The morning sun climbed higher as the pieces fell into place. In the police station, officers noticed their computer systems running strangely slow, the result of federal techs copying every file on their servers. In the courthouse parking lot, more unmarked vehicles arrived, filled with agents waiting for their cue. Thomas straightened his tie as they prepared to transport him to court. His watch, still recording, showed 8:45 a.m. In 15 minutes, the hearing would begin. In 20 minutes, everything would change. The corrupt system that had operated unchecked for so long was about to face its day of reckoning. And at the center of it all, an ordinary traffic stop was about to become the key that unlocked years of systematic abuse and racism, proving that sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places. The morning sun streamed through the high windows of the Pine Grove Courthouse, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. The room was packed. Unusual for a routine preliminary hearing. Officer Walsh shifted uncomfortably in his seat, noticing the unusually large number of suits in the gallery. Something felt off, but he couldn't quite place what. Judge Turner entered, his robes swishing as he took his seat. His eyes swept the courtroom, pausing briefly on the crowd of strangers in the back rows. "Call the first case," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years on the bench. Thomas was led in, still handcuffed, but looking remarkably composed for someone facing serious charges. His attorney, Chen, stood quietly beside him, a thin folder on the table in front of them. The sight of that folder made Officer Parker's stomach twist. It looked too small to contain a proper defense. "Your Honor," the district attorney began, his voice slightly shaky, "the state charges the defendant with possession with intent to distribute." "If I may, Your Honor," Chen interrupted smoothly, rising to his feet. "Before we proceed, I'd like to present some evidence relevant to these charges." He pulled out a laptop and a projector from his briefcase, equipment that seemed far too ready for a routine hearing. The judge raised an eyebrow, but nodded. The courthouse lights dimmed, and the wall behind the judge's bench transformed into a screen. Officer Walsh's coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth as he watched crystal-clear footage of himself approaching Thomas's car the previous evening. "What you're seeing, Your Honor," Chen explained calmly, "is footage from multiple cameras hidden in a government-issued vehicle. The video showed every angle of the traffic stop, including the moment Officer Walsh slipped the bag of drugs under the driver's seat." The gallery erupted in whispers. The sheriff, sitting in the front row, began to stand, but two men in dark suits appeared beside him. "Please remain seated, Sheriff," one said quietly, showing his FBI badge. Chen wasn't finished. "Your Honor, my client is not, as his ID suggests, an insurance salesman." He handed a document to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. "He is a senior operations officer with the Central Intelligence Agency, currently engaged in domestic counterterrorism operations." The color drained from Officer Parker's face as his partner's coffee cup clattered to the floor. The video continued playing, now showing multiple angles of their illegal search, their planted evidence, their casual racism caught in pristine high definition. Furthermore, Chen continued, pulling up a new set of documents on the screen, "This incident is not isolated. We have evidence of 17 similar traffic stops in the past month alone." The screen filled with data, dates, times, license plates, all matching the same pattern. The judge leaned forward, his expression darkening as he studied the evidence. "Mr. Chen, are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Your Honor. I'm presenting evidence of a systematic pattern of civil rights violations, evidence tampering, and police misconduct that extends far beyond this single incident." Chen pressed a button, and the screen filled with financial records. "These documents show where the seized assets from these illegal stops have been going." The sheriff tried to stand again, but more FBI agents had appeared, blocking the exits. In the gallery, several reporters frantically took notes, their phones recording every word. "Your Honor," Chen said, his voice carrying clearly in the now silent courtroom, "I'm turning over all evidence to the U.S. Attorney's Office. We have documented over 300 similar incidents in the past year alone. Every traffic stop, every search, every arrest, all captured by CIA surveillance equipment that these officers never knew existed." Officer Walsh slumped in his chair as more videos played, traffic stops he'd conducted months ago, conversations in patrol cars he thought were private, meetings with the sheriff where they discussed their bonus system for asset seizures. Additionally, Chen added, pulling out one final document, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division has been monitoring this department for the past 6 months. This morning, they're announcing a full federal investigation into systematic civil rights violations across this entire jurisdiction. The judge removed his glasses, rubbing his temples. Officers Walsh and Parker, please surrender your badges and weapons to the federal agents. Sheriff, you'll do the same. You're all being placed under arrest for multiple federal violations. As FBI agents moved forward with handcuffs, Thomas finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority he'd hidden the night before. Sometimes, gentlemen, the people you profile turn out to be exactly the ones who can expose your crimes. The morning sun had climbed higher now, illuminating the shocked faces of the corrupt officers as they were led away. In the gallery, phones buzzed with news alerts as the story broke nationwide. A single traffic stop had just triggered an avalanche that would bury decades of corruption. And Thomas sat quietly, finally uncuffed, watching justice unfold exactly as planned. Sometimes, he thought, the best way to fight corruption wasn't with force, but with patience, technology, and the perfect trap. 6 months after the courthouse revelation, Pine Grove had transformed. The morning sun lit up the new sign outside the police station, which read Community First, a small but significant change that reflected much deeper reforms. Thomas sat in a familiar car on Main Street, but this time he wasn't alone. Next to him sat Mr. Robinson, an elderly resident who'd lived in Pine Grove for 60 years. You know, the old man said, looking out at the changed town. I never thought I'd see the day when my grandkids could drive through here without fear. The impact of that single traffic stop had rippled far beyond Pine Grove's borders. The investigation had uncovered corrupt practices in 3 neighboring counties, leading to the resignation of 2 judges and the arrest of 12 more officers. The FBI's final report detailed over 1,000 cases of wrongful arrests and illegal seizures spanning more than a decade. Inside the renovated police station, new faces filled the halls. The department had been rebuilt from the ground up, with oversight from federal authorities and community leaders. Every patrol car now carried multiple cameras, and officers wore body cams that couldn't be turned off. But more importantly, the force now reflected the diversity of the community it served. The biggest change, Thomas explained to the group of FBI trainees gathered in the conference room, wasn't the technology or the arrests. It was breaking the culture of silence. His presentation had become required viewing at the FBI Academy, a case study in how systematic corruption could be exposed and eliminated. The former sheriff and his officers had faced federal charges. Their trial had made national headlines, not just for the crimes they'd committed, but for the way they'd been caught. Their sentencing had sent a clear message: no badge could shield corruption forever. But the story's impact went beyond criminal justice. The town had used the seized assets recovered during the investigation to establish a community center. The building, once an abandoned warehouse, now housed legal aid offices, youth programs, and support services for families affected by years of police misconduct. Local business owner Mrs. Chen wiped tears from her eyes as she shared her story with a news crew. They took everything from my family 10 years ago, our savings, our store, our dignity. Today, we got it all back, with interest. The restitution program had become a model for other communities facing similar challenges. Thomas walked through the town square, nodding to familiar faces. The CIA had allowed him to remain involved in Pine Grove's transformation, recognizing that sometimes the best way to protect national security was to heal communities from within. At the courthouse, Judge Turner's replacement, a former civil rights attorney, had instituted new procedures for reviewing evidence and monitoring police conduct. We're not just changing rules, she explained during a community meeting. We're changing mindsets. The town's schools had added new curriculum units about civil rights and community policing. Students learned about what had happened in their town, not as a source of shame, but as proof that positive change was possible when people stood up for justice. In the local diner, Officer Walsh's old booth remained empty, a silent reminder of how power could corrupt. But at other tables, new police officers sat with community members, building the trust that had been missing for so long. Thomas's report to CIA headquarters had sparked changes there too. The agency had expanded its domestic corruption monitoring program, recognizing that civil rights violations at home could be as dangerous as threats from abroad. The local newspaper's editor smiled as she showed Thomas their latest headline, "1 year later, how a traffic stop changed everything." The story had won her team a national award, but more importantly, it had helped other communities recognize and address similar problems. As the sun set over Pine Grove, Thomas drove past the spot where he'd been pulled over that fateful night. A small memorial now stood there, not to mark tragedy, but to commemorate transformation. The plaque read simply, "Change begins with courage." In his hotel room, Thomas packed his bags for his next assignment. His phone buzzed with a message from Director Reynolds, Pine Grove model being implemented in 12 more jurisdictions. Good work. He smiled, knowing that sometimes the biggest victories came from the smallest moments of injustice exposed to light. The evening news played quietly in the background, showing footage of the new Pine Grove Police Academy graduation ceremony. The class was the most diverse in the department's history. Each cadet sworn to uphold not just the law, but the principles of equality and justice that had been forgotten for too long. As Thomas took one last drive through town, he reflected on how a simple traffic stop had unleashed a wave of change. The old system of corruption had been replaced by something new, not perfect, but striving to be better. And in the end, that's what justice was really about, not just punishing wrongdoing, but building something better in its place. The stars came out over Pine Grove, shining down on a town that had faced its demons and chosen a different path. Sometimes Thomas thought the best way to fight darkness wasn't with more darkness, but with the steady, persistent light of truth and justice.